Hello and welcome to ABN's Jihad Watch program. I'm Robert Spencer, and we are continuing this week our discussions with prominent freedom fighters, prominent people who are working to preserve our constitutional rights and the great heritage of our Judeo-Christian civilization. And we are very privileged in today's episode to be joined by Dr. Charles Jacobs. Dr. Charles Jacobs is the head of Americans for Peace and Tolerance, which is a human rights organization that we will be discussing with him momentarily. He has been named by the Jewish Daily Forward as one of America's top 50 Jewish leaders. He has founded and led several highly successful organizations characterized by groundbreaking ideas and initiatives, including the Boston branch of the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America. In 1993, together with Muslim and Christian Africans, Dr. Jacobs founded the American Anti-Slavery Group, which is dedicated to bringing international attention to the enslavement of black Africans in Sudan. And Dr. Jacobs indeed went himself to Sudan to participate in the freeing of slaves. Dr. Jacobs, welcome, and thanks for being on the program.
It's an honor to be with you, Robert.
The honor is all mine. Tell us a little bit about the Americans for Peace and Tolerance, and perhaps some of your other adventures as well.
Well, Americans for Peace and Tolerance started about 6 years ago, and its purpose is to expose the two main ideological threats to the West, which is left-wing radicalism and Islamist radicalism. And we've understood, as you have, that leftists in the West have linked up, allied with Islamists in what people may have thought to be a very illogical alliance, but it's not really, and are fomenting problems and defaming the West and Israel and Christianity and anything that has to do with our Western heritage. And,
Charles, I've got to ask you one thing about that. That was an extraordinary thing you said there, that people think it's an illogical alliance between the left and Islamic supremacists, and yet you say it's not really. Can you unpack that a little bit, explain that a bit for us?
I think so. It seems illogical because, Westerners like bikinis and Islamists like burqas. And Westerners like free love and free speech, they say, and Islamists don't like any of that. However, they both share certain ideological desires for one-worldism. For the Islamists, it's the caliphate. Sharia law shall govern all of us. And for the West, it used to be called, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, in softer Marxist terms, it's called one world government, the UN, global citizenship, et cetera, et cetera. And they both despise Western freedoms and capitalism. They want centrally planned governments. They detest Western religions, Judaism and Christianity. So they have an awful lot in common, and the leftists have really been the ones to enable Islamist penetration into the West. They believe, as leftists do since Karl Marx, that religion is the opiate of the people and it's an epiphenomenon, and nobody really believes in that stuff anyway. And if you give people enough money and good jobs, all that hocus pocus of religion will fall by the wayside. Well, we have news for them. That's not the way it has ever worked, and this alliance with the Muslim world will be swallowed up, God forbid, if the Muslim world wins this contest of civilizations.
Indeed,
they will be swallowed up along with the rest of us, maybe even first.
So, Charles, Americans for Peace and Tolerance, what is exactly its agenda in combating this leftist and jihadi and Islamic supremacist alliance?
Well, we like to do local campaigns that are victorious and that teach people what the problem is and that teach them how to win. So, for example, we were the ones who exposed the radical leadership in the largest mosque on the Eastern Seaboard, which is in Boston. We found out that Yusuf Qaradawi, who is the spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, and who, with 3 clicks on your Google here, anybody's laptop can find Yusuf Qaradawi, inciting throngs in Cairo to destroy the West and kill every one of the world's Jews. Well, it turned out that Yusuf Qaradawi was a trustee of the Islamic Society of Boston Mega Mosque in downtown Boston. And we exposed that. We got sued for it. We fought back. And now an awful lot of people in Boston know about this, and they have been somewhat marginalized. The battle continues, as always. And there are those on the left, and I have to say particularly on the Jewish left, who simply want to do outreach and dialogue, and if we're nice to them, they'll be nice to us, etc. And we fight that. Indeed, if I can say, a couple of weeks ago, Glenn Beck's The Blaze came up to Boston and did a very nice 20-minute story on how we have, and to some extent, marginalized them.
That's excellent. Charles,
yeah, you'll love the film.
Since you mentioned it, can you give us a bit of a background on why Americans should be concerned about the Islamic Society of Boston today, beyond Sheikh Qaradawi? How has the Islamic Society of Boston figured in more recent news?
Well, in very recent news, you all, unfortunately, we remember the Boston Marathon bombing. The Boston Marathon bombing was done by 2 Muslims who were radicalized, who came to America. The Tsarnaev brothers came to America. They were probably normal kids, and went to the Islamic Society of Boston's first mosque before its extension into the mega mosque. Its first mosque was in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And they went there, and we have discovered the curriculum that the Islamic Society of Boston uses, and the Muslim Brotherhood uses in general, to radicalize America's historically moderate Muslim community. And they went there, and that mosque was founded by Alamudi, Abdul Rahman Alamudi, way back. He now is in jail for decades for having raised funds for Al Qaeda and having partaking in an assassination plot, guided, I think, by the former president of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi. Alamudi and his mosque. Alamudi is, I would say, the poster boy for Islamist penetration into the Western world. Here you have a man who convinced everybody that he was truly a moderate. He convinced President Clinton, who gave Alamudi the ability to choose which Muslim chaplains would function in the United States Army. Not good. And he was in the White House invited to the White House when George Bush was president. So here's a man who faked out everyone. Again, the theme of this is deception, and these people are quite good at it. He wound up being discovered. As I said, he was convicted and sent to prison. They caught him on tape saying, "I support Hamas and Hezbollah," and they caught him with a bunch of money, and they caught him fundraising for Al Qaeda. And yet, here's the man who built the mosque that the Tsarnaev brothers later, decades later, went to, may well have been radicalized there and blew up Boston. So that's the connection, and I wish I had a chart here to show you the lines, but that's pretty simple one.
It is, Charles. And look, surely, if you have a mosque that is founded by an Al-Qaeda financier, an open supporter of Hamas and Hezbollah, and a mosque that has on its board somebody who has praised Hitler and said that the Muslims need to finish his job, and someone who, and you have this mosque, the same mosque, where two jihad terrorists attended and may have learned their vision of jihad there. Surely the FBI was all over this, right? I mean, no doubt when you began to uncover this information, you tripped over 100 FBI agents who were surveilling the Islamic Society of Boston and keeping it under close watch, no?
That's not the way it works, Robert, because
What a
the
surprise.
FBI has been politically neutered, to be kind about it, because they have got instructions not to ask any questions about the faith, the professed faith of the perpetrators of any terrorist act. That's their marching orders. In fact, what happened is that we, I forgot the exact date, it was in 2009, we were asked to brief the FBI. Why was that? Because as a consequence of the lawsuit against us by the Islamic Society of Boston, our lawyers did something called discovery. And discovery is a wonderful counter weapon for those people who have been falsely accused. We were accused of defaming them because we simply pointed out who were their leaders and where their money was coming from. So in discovery, they claimed that the defamation that we presumably had done had cost them money, and they were not as able to raise funds for their mosque as they had been before we brought out to public these connections. So in order to defend ourselves, we could subpoena their bank books and many of their internal emails, which we did. And we now are the proud possessors of 40 boxes, big boxes, of every one of the checks they wrote from date X to date Y, and much of their internal communications. And so the FBI asked us in 2009 to brief them. We briefed them, and I have, in our possession, we have the briefing because it was a PowerPoint, and we put it on a disk, a thumb drive, and we handed it, one copy of it, to them afterwards, so we know that what we briefed them on. And in the briefing, which took an hour and a half, showing them these checks and the internal emails and who that in fact it was a Muslim Brotherhood front.
And what did they do? They must have shut it down, didn't they?
I think they might want to shut us down. They didn't shut it down at all. In fact, recently, when the former FBI head was testifying to Congress, he was asked, and there's a beautiful video clip of this. He was asked, wait a minute, the Tsarnaev brothers went to this mosque and then they blew up the marathon in Boston, and weren't you guys briefed in Boston about the dangers of that mosque on this date in 2009? And weren't FBI agents told specifically that that's a Qaradawi-related mosque that was founded by Al-Amudi? Didn't you know that the mosque was founded by Al-Amudi, who's now in jail for decades because he's a funder for Al-Qaeda? Didn't you know that? And the FBI former head said, I didn't know. So either these were incompetent people who we were briefing, although they didn't seem that way to us because they asked lots of good questions, or it's taboo to mention the topic. And they didn't send it up the ladder because they thought they might have their wrists slapped if they did, because it's taboo to say about anybody who kills saying he did it for Allah or saying he did it for jihad. It's taboo to link that person and his professed beliefs to the actual crime. Because if you did that, then you would be a racist, Islamophobic bigot instead of a person who actually has two eyes in the front of his head.
Yeah, I can tell you, Charles, personally, I myself used to train FBI agents, as well as CIA and various branches of the military, on the teachings of the Quran, the biography of Muhammad according to the earliest Muslim sources, and related material. And that was all stopped in 2010 and culminated in a letter in 2011 that 57 Muslim organizations signed onto, including the Hamas-linked Muslim Brotherhood Front Group, the Council on American Islamic Relations, and others, demanding that I and other trainers who taught the truth about the nature and magnitude of the jihad threat be let go, and that all materials that taught that there was any connection between Islam and jihad and terrorism be scrubbed from FBI training manuals. And so we see now the fruit of that in Boston, that we have FBI agents who are clueless, who are forbidden to study the evidence, bound to be willfully ignorant about the motives and goals of the people who have vowed to destroy us. And so they see all the things that you brought them in Boston, and I expect that they didn't know what to do with it. They were afraid of being, as you say, reprimanded as being bigoted and racist for discussing these things. They were afraid that they were going to tread on too many politically correct toes, and so this information was swept under the rug. It might
well have cost lives.
Yes, absolutely.
It well have cost lives. This is not a trivial matter. Political correctness is seeming to me to be the suicide belt of the West. We are blinding ourselves purposefully, willfully, in order to bend over backwards so that we won't be accused of hating all Muslims, which we never did and would never do. But that's the charge against us, and that's precisely the weapon that the other side uses to such great effect to cover up all of the activities of radical Muslim leaders here.
People are afraid. People are intimidated by this. They think that if they talk about it, then they will be branded as racist and bigoted. The Islamic supremacists and the jihadis know they can use this as a weapon to subdue any opposition and to cow and intimidate people, to frighten them into silence and make them think that if they speak out, they will be branded, their careers could be ruined. You know, we saw the same thing in Fort Hood with all those people, the superiors of Major Nidal Hassan, giving positive performance evaluations to him, even though many of his colleagues had expressed concern about his jihadi sentiments. They knew that if they said anything about it, there would be some sort of huge expose about Islamophobia in the military. New York Times would be all over it. CARE would be all over it. Their careers would be ruined. But in any case, this is the world we're living in. And another aspect of your work with Americans for Peace and Tolerance is to call attention to how that intimidation has also influenced and twisted the educational system. And so I wanted to ask you about this campaign that you've started running ads in newspapers calling on public schools in Newton, Massachusetts to remove hateful educational materials from their curricula. Wissam, can you show the ad, please? There it is. What are Newton students really learning? Well, what are they really learning in Newton public schools, Charles?
Well, they're learning politically correct education. That's what they're learning. They're learning that at base, the problem in the world is white people who have too much power. They're learning that darker-skinned or impoverished people have a higher moral claim than anyone else. They're learning that all cultures are morally equivalent, and that to focus on or even mention flaws in the other's culture, or to mention the bad conduct that people other than Westerners have, is simply taboo, not to be done, and racist. This, of course, means that they're not learning that Christians all around the Middle East and in the Islamic world are being hunted, haunted, enslaved, murdered, run off from their homelands, out of their homelands. They're not learning any of that. They're not learning that gays are hung in the public squares in Tehran. They're not learning that Arabs have black slaves today in Sudan and Mauritania. They're not learning that the slaves in Mauritania are even African Muslims. So you have Arab Muslims enslaving African Muslims. They're not learning that women are sexually, genitally mutilated throughout much of the Islamic world. They're not learning that free speech is forbidden, and that these places are tyrannies of the worst sort. So they don't learn any of that. What they do learn is to be hypercritical of the West, and particularly America. America, they learn, is a country that stole the land from the Indians, that enslaved black people, and that is wealthy comparative to the rest of the world only because it exploits the rest of the world. That's the basic underlying, I would say, ideology, politically correct ideology. Now, on top of that, they specifically learn to glorify or to have great respect for the religion of Islam. They're not taught any of the things in Islam that would and should worry people. They're only taught that Islam is a peaceful religion that is tolerant of others. And this is simply not the case, never has been the case. We wish it would.
What might be the effect of that? That you have all this negativity about their own civilization and nothing but positive and uncritical reporting about Islamic civilization. What do you think is the effect and the goal of this kind of education?
Well, I think the goal is the leftist goal. I mean, in the Muslim goal. The leftist goal is to weaken America because America is the bad power player in the world. And if America were weakened, I mean, it's the goal of, it seems, the Obama administration as well. If America were taken down a notch, the world would be more peaceful. And so we're not an exceptional country. We're not a country that helps the world at all. We're a country, and it gives the world enormous gifts from our creativity and our industriousness. We're quite the opposite. So you should be ashamed a little bit of being an American, and you should raise your voice to be critical of all American, of American diplomatic and military activity. And that's the leftist agenda. The Muslim agenda, and I can tell you there are Muslim funders of some of this stuff. The Muslim agenda is, again, to weaken the West and to make Islam seem like a pretty good alternative to Christianity, certainly Judaism, or at least that it's even if you're not going to be a Muslim yourself, of all the religions, this one is comparatively okay. It's comparatively okay. So that's the goal. The result is that by the time, I'll tell you, I'm a Jewish activist that I was one of the first people to call attention to the enormous problem that pro-Israel people and Jews have on college campuses. And this was like 15 years ago when I started something called the David Project. There are other things called Stand With Us on the West Coast. We were on the East Coast. And it was the case that Jews on college campuses were finding that the language of the day and the thought of the day was that Israel is a pretty bad place. And we didn't know how that happened or what to do about it. And we started to educate people and educate Jews, first of all, who were going to the campuses so they would be aware that this was happening and how to fight back. But what we didn't know so much was that the same poison had been seeping into the high schools, K to 12, even before the high schools. I had written in 1991 an expose of this. I may even hold it up. This is a Moment magazine, 1991, and you probably can't see it, but I was this young guy with a beard. Even there I was, a young guy with a beard. You probably can't see that. And I wrote an article called Arab PR, in which I cataloged not only the college campuses, not only the liberal churches where anti-Israelism and pro-Islam was sneaking in and having an effect, but also in high schools. And I traced back and found, other people found it as well, an effort that was brilliant. High school teachers, look, most teachers today are not subject matter experts. I mean, even, you know, critics of our own educational system will tell you that the math teachers aren't really all that great in math, but they know how to teach, so to speak. So certainly that's true in the Middle East, in studies about world history in the Middle East and civilizations and religions. So a group called AWARE, I forgot what it means now, Arab World something, put together the Arab World Studies Notebook, which was a loose leaf book filled with handouts. Now, why did they use handouts? Why didn't they use textbooks? Because already many people in the Jewish community found out that there were groups from the left and from the Islamic world who were trying to influence public education by persuading textbook publishers to adopt their view of things in the Middle East, about America, about the Crusades, about Christians. But textbooks can be vetted. And there were groups that vetted them and pushed back and corrected much of that. What could not easily be vetted were so-called supplemental materials. So there are 5 or 8 groups out there that are Arab, Islamic, who have designed workshops for teachers. And under the guise of, or under the banner of conflict resolution, world peace, intercultural understanding, etc., peace studies, teachers go to these workshops and they're given these packets. And they don't know, you know, and most of them are kind of neutral sounding, although not all, and they have no clue what these are about. And they bring them back into the classroom, and it has spread throughout the country. This is throughout the country. So now when you have people graduating from high school, they're already anti-Israel before, many of them, already have negative views about Israel and about Christianity and about the West before they even get to these horrible college professors who are the masters of the poisoning.
This is amazing. Charles, we're going to have to take a break just briefly, and then we'll be back for another half hour. I do want to ask you about some of these particular things in the Newton curriculum as just symptomatic and emblematic of a much larger problem. This is fascinating, odd, and disturbing material you're bringing to us today. Very happy you're here with us. I'm Robert Spencer with ABN's Jihad Watch program. We're here with Dr. Charles Jacobs of Americans for Peace and Tolerance. We've been discussing the corrupt material that is anti-Israel, anti-American, anti-Christian, and pro-jihad, pro-Islam in American textbooks. And we'll be right back with much more of this after these messages.
The Bible is not a series of disconnected stories. It is a single narrative in which every story, every character points beyond itself to one who is greater. The story of Adam and Eve is not just about the first man and woman. There is a true and better Adam who passed the test in the garden and whose obedience is ascribed to us. There is a true and better Abel who, though innocently slain, has blood that cries out, not for our condemnation, but for our acquittal. There is a true and better Abraham who answered the call of God to leave all the comfortable and familiar and go out into the void to create a new people of God. There is a true and better Isaac the son of laughter, of grace, who was not just offered up by his Father on the mount, but was truly sacrificed for us all. There is a true and better Jacob, who wrestled and took the blow of justice we deserve, so we, like Jacob, only receive the wounds of grace that wake us up and discipline us. There is a true and better Joseph, who at the right hand of the king forgives those who betrayed and sold him and uses his new power to save them. There is a true and better Moses, who stands in the gap between the people and the Lord and who mediates a new covenant. There is a true and better rock of Moses, who struck with the rod of God's justice now gives us water in the desert. There is a true and better Job, the truly innocent sufferer, who then intercedes for and saves his foolish friends. There is a true and better David, whose victory becomes his people's victory, though they never lifted a stone to accomplish it themselves. There is a true and better Esther, who didn't just risk losing an earthly palace, but lost the ultimate heavenly one, who didn't just risk his life, but gave his life to save his people. There is a true and better Jonah, who was cast out into the storm so that we could be brought in. There is a true and better Passover lamb, innocent, perfect, helpless, slain so the angel of death will pass over us. He's the true temple, the true prophet, the true priest, the true king, the true sacrifice, the true lamb, the true light, and the true bread. The Bible is not a series of disconnected stories. It is a single narrative that points to one person, Jesus.
And we're back. I am Robert Spencer, and this is Jihad Watch on ABN, and we are here discussing the Islamization of American public school textbooks with Dr. Charles Jacobs, and he's been giving us some harrowing examples of this material and how it is designed to turn young people against their own nation, their own heritage, against Israel, against Judaism, against Christianity, against so many things, while being warmly positive about Islam and jihad. Dr. Jacobs is the head of Americans for Peace and Tolerance, which is a human rights organization dedicated to fighting against the leftist Islamic supremacist alliance. Charles, once again, I'm looking at this flyer that you have about the material in the Newton Public Schools, and I'm just stunned by this. It says, a Muslim primer recommends the writings of Sayyid Qutb, who is a leading Muslim Brotherhood theorist. As you say here on the flyer, he inspired Osama bin Laden. How is this actually a book that's used in the Newton, Massachusetts public schools?
Well, let me back, yes, it is. Let me back up and say that when we found out that they were using the Arab World Studies notebook, which, by the way, was Saudi-funded from Aramco oil company, and which taught, this is how we found the story. Some young girl came home to her dad and said, is it true that Jews kill Arab women in Israeli jails by the hundreds? And he was shocked, and he went to the school and he complained, and he was blown off But he found out that it was the Arab World Studies notebook, which I had written about in 1991, and which was funded by Aramco, and which somehow got into the Newton Public Schools, and I can tell you how it got into it later. We protested. We went to school committee hearings every other Monday. I mean, I ruined my dinner. I went at 7 o'clock at night, and we carefully asked the people to explain how this could be, and wouldn't they take it out. And for a year, they defended it as it's another point of view. It's another point of view.
Do they ever get to the other point of view? Do they ever have, in this material, is there anything pro-Israel, pro-Judeo-Christian tradition? I mean, it seems to me, whenever I've seen this material, it's entirely one-sided. There's not anything that balances it. Is that a correct impression?
That's exactly right. There might be 1 or 2 articles, in, out of 15 that would say something not to balance it, not right-wing, but to say something. Well, Israel's not so bad. Israel's okay. That's So you get from the Arab side and the left side, Israel's terrible, terrible, terrible. 13 articles, and then you might get 1 or 2 that says Israel is not really that bad. Israel's okay. But the shocking thing about this was that how did that get into the school? Well, Harvard University has a thing called the Center for Middle East Studies, and it's partially funded by a sheikh from the Middle East, and partially funded with Title VI federal funding. There are about 8 or 10 universities in the country that get Title VI funding for specialized studies. It could be, astronomy. It could be physics. At Harvard, it's the Middle East. So this money from the feds comes with strings. What are the strings? That you must share with the public the results of your studies. And how do you share it? You hold teacher training workshops. So the Harvard Middle East Studies department had on its website that they indeed had a workshop with 80 teachers, 80, Newton's a big city, from Newton, Massachusetts. And guess who ran the workshop? A man named Paul Baran. Who's Paul Baran? Paul Baran is the head of the Harvard Center for Middle East Studies Teacher Outreach. And he also was a man who led the divestment campaign against Israel in Somerville, Massachusetts. So Saudi money, Harvard University, anti-Israel activists, Newton teachers, heads, brains of school children. Jews kill Arab women in jails. Pretty good. That's pretty good. Now, the Muslim Primer is a book that, among other things, that we mentioned about Qutb, but among other things, the author of the book says he was inspired to write the book by Yusuf Qaradawi. Hey. So, and here's the answer. So the school, by the way, just to turn back, the school committee finally took out the Arab World Studies notebook, but they said they took it out because it was outdated. Not that it was anti-Semitic, not that it was a funded piece of hate literature by the Saudis that penetrated Newton, but that it was outdated. So the Muslim Primer, whose author says in the foreword that he was inspired to write the book by Yusuf Qaradawi, is used in the schools, but the school says only chapter 2, which has to do with women under Islam, is being handed out. That would be like, if Mein Kampf had a chapter on how to do push-ups for Nazis, or, now the kids were not, I can't swear, but I almost could swear that the kids were not told that this chapter on women in the Muslim world comes from a book that's inspired by a Nazi Islamist. I'm sure they weren't told that. So that's the problem that we have. And the bigger problem is, as you well know, none of the organizations in the Jewish world who are supposed to protect us from this defamation, like the Anti-Defamation League, will do anything. And it turns out that they're fighting me about it because they find fault with my ad and are a little perturbed that we have the pictures of the publicly elected officials on the Newton School Committee on the ad, and that we would dare point out that these folks are responsible for what happens in the classroom. So here we are, leading a grassroots group that's going up against not only the Saudis and not only the leftists and not only Harvard University, but the very Jewish groups who are supposed to be protecting us all.
Well, you know, Charles, I happen to notice that a Muslim primer is not written by a Muslim, at least not from the appearance of the name Ira G. Zepp, Jr.
Yeah.
It sounds like that's probably another leftist who is enamored of Islam.
It would seem he's certainly enamored with Islam, and I would imagine that he's a leftist. Look, this is, if it weren't tragic, it'd be funny.
Yes.
You know.
Well, we get to some funny material here with this a world where womanhood reigns supreme.
Yes.
This handout that says that Western gender equality is an unacceptable system of values, and that miniskirts and plunging necklines represent oppression. And I suppose that the burqa and the niqab represent liberation?
That would be the idea, I suppose. That look, I mean, as a dad of two daughters, I don't much like miniskirts either. But I don't think that Western women are oppressed by miniskirts. And my goodness, we do know what oppression looks like for women in much of the Islamic world. I mean, all you have to do is listen to the women themselves, many of the women themselves, those who haven't either been, beaten, browbeaten, or brainwashed, or scared to death. Yeah, that's so. So this is, we're teaching in the Newton schools that everybody's viewpoint is legitimate except for the West, and so be cognizant that it's not an automatic to say that just because women are forced to wear these things, these walking caskets, that they don't that all of them don't appreciate some aspect of it. So you should be tolerant of this. My goodness.
And so what they're essentially doing is offering Islamic law, Sharia, and the societal system that Sharia recommends, which institutionalizes oppression of women in all sorts of ways, as a superior societal model to that of the West, no?
Well, to be fair and honest, we don't exactly know how the material is taught in school. And I suspect that if they had a debate in the school, and I'm told that if they had a debate in the school, the girls are not going to come out, cheering for the hijab. On the other hand, they're certainly going to be made sensitized to be respectful of things that they wouldn't be respectful in their own culture. They wouldn't be respectful. They're not taught about life of women, really. They're not taught about what happens to infidels, Christians, Jews, blacks, gays. That just wouldn't be right, because if you taught them that, you see, then how could you get to peace? Because then they would be annoyed, and they might be angered that a certain civilization would treat people who they, in their left-wingism, they in their human rights life, would be championing and defending. So why would you teach these truths that would lead not to peace, but more conflict? So truth is not the goal. The goal is peace.
So what they're essentially doing is betraying Muslim women to this vision of peace, and betraying their own professed understanding of human rights by not standing up for the human rights of Muslim women, but acquiescing in this oppression and making excuses for it, and even comparing it favorably to the situation of women in the West. That seems to me to be a complete abdication of their moral responsibility to speak out against injustice, which they claim to uphold in every other context.
Listen, I ran into this when I was president of the American Anti-Slavery Group, and we were exposing and actually redeeming black Christian slaves and black Muslim slaves, actually, from the Sudanese jihadis. I found that the human rights establishment, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, et cetera, the UN, of course, would have none of this. They didn't want to hear about it because even though they proclaim to be motivated by human rights and a single standard of justice around the world, that's not it at all. They're motivated by their sense of guilt for being white people because they've been blasted from who knows what grade, 3, 4, with the notion that white people are bad and that and the West has been evil and it has to be excoriated and fixed. And as a white person in the West, what moral standing do you have, having enslaved blacks, stolen the land from the Indians, and exploited the world? What moral standing might you possibly have to point out that black people in Sudan are enslaved by Arabs? This would be, just beyond the pale for you to say such a thing. Now that, I recall, they abandoned the most vulnerable people on the earth at that time, 10, 15 years ago, who the Southern Sudanese, millions of whom were murdered in a self-declared jihad from Khartoum, and hundreds of thousands of whom were forcibly enslaved by Arabs. So the entire West, I won't say the entire, there were some decent liberals there, I can tell you, particularly the Black Caucus in the Congress, and others, Nat Hentoff, and some others. But for the most part, the human rights establishment can't stand these stories because it gets in the way of what they want to do, which is to excoriate the West and to self-abnegate and to say, I accept the guilt of being a Westerner, and by my acceptance of that guilt and by hectoring the West, and particularly Israel, for any flaw, or whether true or pretended, or made up or lied about in their character, by doing that, by self-abnegating and attacking the West, that way I can release myself of the guilt of being a Westerner, and in that way I can actually add something to a world peace that will come when the West only learns to take its proper position. That's it.
It's the same thing with the anti-Israel material. That I think that comes from the same kind of civilizational guilt. That
it does. I mean, the irony here for us Jews is that in the last go-round, in the last century, the Jews were hated because we didn't belong to any nation, and we were, world people, right? So now the world flipped around and hates nation states, right? I think the prophet is John Lennon.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, imagine all that nonsense.
Imagine. Imagine there be no nations.
Yeah.
And there would be peace. So now the Jews are hated because they have a nation state, and they are nationalists. And they do say we're rooted, before we were rootless cosmopolites.
Yes, that's Stalin's term, yes.
Yeah. So now we're rooted nationalists, and we're hated for that. So it seems Jew hatred is the constant, and the variable is whatever you want to call them.
But you were talking about, we talk about people being guilty for being Westerners. Do you think that some of it has to do with that the Jews went to Israel and made it into a prosperous first world nation, while the nations all around it languish in poverty and are on the international dole? I think that that arouses a certain kind of resentment in terms of the grievance mongering that the Islamic jihadis relentlessly do among their own people. But do you think that it also arouses some self-hatred and civilizational guilt among Israelis themselves and their supporters?
Well, among the leftists.
Yeah.
It's because, success, success is not a good thing. You should, on the one hand it is, but on the other hand, what about, how has your success hurt other people? And do you really want to shame the Muslim world and the Arab world around you because you crawled out of the ovens of Europe, and your survivors were able to beat off the attack of 6 Arab armies and to create a wondrous new world in what had been a desert? And look what the Arabs did. I mean, the Egyptians are starving. I mean, the statistics on reading in the Arab Islamic world are pretty, shameful. Statistics on anything. So this is taken by the left as something that you shouldn't, should never be brought up. And look, people hate for jealousy also.
Yes.
That's not a new story.
Not at all, not at all, and I think that has a great deal to do with this. And so when we see this in this Islamic history handout, and it says that the handout ignores Arab genocidal threats against Israel and terrorist attacks prior to 1967, while claiming that Israeli intransigence, not Palestinian hatred and terrorism, is to blame for the lack of peace, that seems to be the prevailing view of the Obama administration and of the present government. I think that jealousy does have a great deal to do with it, that they think that the Israelis have unjustly prospered. When it comes, here again, talking about the left, when it comes to Muslims who hate Israel, it's rooted in Quranic teaching about the Jews being the worst enemies of the Muslims and the necessity for Islamic land to remain under the control of the Muslims forever, if it ever was. It's the same kind of claim to Spain, for that matter. But can you outline a little bit about what exactly is so wrong with this? What kinds of things are preventing peace, really, for Israel today, in real life, not in terms of this propaganda?
Right. Well, what's preventing peace is what has always prevented peace, which is the Muslim rejection of non-Muslim sovereignty on what they call holy Arab soil. So, as you say, I think wherever an Arab goat defecated throughout history, they claim that as theirs, or wherever they held sovereignty. And even in Spain, in southern Spain now, Andalus, bin Laden claimed it as Muslim. So for the Jews to be who were like the Christians in legal terms, dhimmi are people of the book, that is, Jews and Christians who have a revelation, although it's not as good as the Muslim one, it still was a revelation and it had to do with monotheism. And so the Jews and Christians under Islam were allowed to remain in very poor circumstances, Jews and Christians, and were not forced to convert, except at the times where they were. So for the Jews who were dhimmi, and who throughout the Muslim world had to live as, second class is not the way to describe it, subjugated and humiliated peoples, for them to all of a sudden declare their political independence and defeat Arab armies, this is the deepest of, it's a theological humiliation. It's just not to be, it's not to be accepted by the Muslim world, and that's why the Jews don't have peace. It has nothing to do with the size of Israel. I mean, Israel could and has, I think, foolishly made territorial concessions. It has nothing to do. It's not a border war. It's a war of civilizations. And so, and the Jews are coming late to understanding this, although they are. And the West refuses to. It doesn't want to understand just the simple basics.
Well, Charles, we're coming to the end of the hour. I wonder if in the remaining few minutes you could tell us a little bit about some of the other initiatives of Americans for Peace and Tolerance, some of the other work you've been doing.
We did something I think you'll really appreciate, and your audience will really appreciate. Northeastern University, like many universities, has a Middle East Studies department, which is virulently anti-Israel. And like many universities, has a campus Islamic chaplain, the campus imam. Now, when I grew up and when you grew up, there weren't too many campus imams, but now there are. And the one that it has at that it had at Northeastern, Abdul Farouk, was an Islamic Society of Boston guy. And we caught him on film urging Northeastern Muslim students to support Tariq Mahana, who was a convicted terrorist who also went to the Islamic Society of Boston Mosque. And Tariq Mahana is in jail now for 23 years because he plotted to shoot up a shopping mall in Attleboro, Massachusetts, much like the Mumbai shooting. And there we have caught the campus imam, who's supposed to be giving Muslim students, young Muslims on the campus of Northeastern, decent guidance about how to become a Muslim and an American. He was telling them to support this terrorist. And we also caught him on film telling his own congregation, quote, more or less, quote unquote, it's time to to go out to the street, do your job, pick up your gun and your sword, and do your job. When we got those films, we sent them to the lawyers for Northeastern who had heard that we had these films, and he's gone. He's been dismissed. I think it's the first case ever of an imam on a campus that's been dismissed, and we're pretty proud of that. Of course, the university, just like the Newton School Committee, didn't fess up to having been penetrated by the Arab World Studies Notebook. So too, Northeastern University simply airbrushed Abdullah Farouk out of their websites, like Stalin would have done. So we did that, and we continue to monitor campuses and work with students around the New England area. And I mean, and of course we made the film Losing Our Sons, which we've talked about before on your program. So we're pretty busy. It's hard to fight the leftists and the Islamists. It's even harder when the so-called Jewish defense groups are not on your side. But we're happy because we're winning fights, and I think winning fights is the most important thing.
Absolutely. And there's always the satisfaction of knowing you have the truth on your side, you have justice on your side, you're doing the right thing, and so that's all anybody can be expected to do. Dr. Charles Jacobs, I commend you for your work and thank you for being with us today. This has been a most illuminating hour about the work of Americans for Peace and Tolerance, the Islamization of the textbooks, and so much more. I wish that there were many, many more Americans like you out on the front lines fighting against these insidious attempts to subvert our freedoms and to inflict propaganda upon our children. But in any case, thank you for your work. Thank you for being here. Dr. Charles Jacobs has been our guest, and this has been ABN's Jihad Watch program. Thank you for watching. I'm Robert Spencer.